I'm Sara Goldvine, and this is Let's Talk Housing, a podcast by BC Housing. In this space, we explore the complex systemic issues that make it challenging for many people in British Columbia to access and afford a home. The provincial government has an ambitious plan with the largest investment in housing affordability in BC's history. Tasked with helping deliver on this plan is BC Housing, which is working with hundreds of partners to develop, manage, and administer a wide range of affordable housing and homelessness services in hundreds of communities across the province. In this podcast, you'll hear from those delivering innovative and exciting affordable housing solutions.
Hello, and welcome to Let's Talk Housing. I'm Sara Goldvine. Today, we're talking about cooperative housing. More than 30,000 people live in co-op housing across British Columbia. Like many other types of housing, co-ops are facing pressures from increasing demand, aging buildings, and changing communities. But while some of these challenges may be familiar to listeners of Let's Talk Housing, the way that co-ops are addressing these challenges is unique. Today, we'll talk about how co-op members are working together to preserve housing and create more homes in communities around the province. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are recording from the ancestral and unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. We offer respect to their peoples, past and present. Today on Let's Talk Housing, I'm joined by Thom Armstrong, CEO of the Co-operative Housing Federation of BC. The Co-operative Housing Federation of BC is made up of member housing co-ops and associated organizations across British Columbia that come together to unite, represent, and serve co-ops and their members. Also joining me is Tiffany Duzita, Executive Director of the Community Land Trust. The Community Land Trust is an arm of the Federation which acquires, develops, and stewards co-ops and community-led housing and spaces. Thom, Tiffany, welcome to Let's Talk Housing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thom, we had you on season 1 of Let's Talk Housing, and we said we'd have you back to help us set the foundation for a conversation today. Can you start by telling our listeners a little bit about cooperative housing and the work that your organization does?
I'm happy to do that, and it's a real pleasure to be here. So housing co-ops are sometimes referred to as the best kept secret in the housing ecosystem. Simple in theory, quite complicated in practice. Essentially, a co-op is just a legal association that owns or leases housing for the benefit of its members. Now, that's the dry legal explanation. Co-ops are also known to be communities where people grow, develop, age in place, and really build bonds that make people think beyond the bricks and mortar of housing and to what really keeps people together in a community setting. And that's never been more apparent than it was during the pandemic. So co-ops really serve their members. So the residents of co-ops are members of an association that provides governance through the election of a board of directors, the appointment of committees. Members make all of the basic or fundamental decisions around the housing. And from that springs, as I mentioned before, bonds of community that provide security of tenure, resident input into housing, and a whole host of other benefits that people refer to when they talk about what drew them to housing co-ops in the first place. So our role as the Federation is to support those communities, help them build their governance and management capacity, offer them services that reduce the cost of their day-to-day operations, advocate for them to government when that's necessary, and to help them with their long-term building, asset management planning, and financing so that they remain safe, secure, affordable housing in viable communities for many generations to come.
I really appreciate that you've touched on the importance of community there, Thom. I lived in housing co-ops for years, and I have to say that that really was what I noticed in terms of the difference. And speaking of community, of course, there's also the Community Land Trust. So Tiffany, this is a great chance to bring you in. Can you talk us a little bit about what the Land Trust is and how do you work with co-ops to actually preserve and build more housing?
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned earlier, it was established by the Co-operative Federation of BC and has actually roots that all go back to 1993. Just a quick timeline, though, it accepted its first properties in the early 2000s. But as they saw kind of growth of cooperative housing kind of decline over multiple decades, if I can speak on behalf of CHFBC, took that initiative probably almost 10 years. Those conversations started up again about how to use the community land trust as a vehicle for growth. And it started out with a partnership in the city of Vancouver on 4 city sites to build 358 homes, combination of cooperative homes and nonprofit homes with some great partners on those sites. And then that just kind of took off from there into 2015 to where we are today. And I think our portfolio right now is, we've got just under 2,000 homes that are currently occupied, and that's a majority of those are cooperative homes. And we have another about 1,200 that are kind of under construction or going through the municipal process as well. So definitely on the growth trajectory, and you touched on the relationships too that we have with housing co-ops. We're working with existing housing co-ops that are challenged, that are looking for opportunities to preserve the homes, and what type of partnerships could they form with the community land trust to not only achieve the mission and the objectives of the land trust, but also the co-ops themselves. And then we're building new. So brand new housing co-ops that are welcoming members. With our latest one was about a year ago with Kinship Housing Co-op, and we'll soon be welcoming into a seniors co-op here in the city of Vancouver early next year as well on Fraser Street. It's called North Arm Housing Co-op. So we're excited about that one coming on board too, and welcoming new members into that community.
And I mean, what you're talking about here, these are very often very complex development deals, very complicated legal arrangements. I want to just dig in a little bit into a specific example so we can really help people understand what this means for members of co-ops. And of course, we were at an announcement in July specifically for around 2 co-ops in the city of Burnaby. And this is 425 units of affordable housing that the members actually activated and worked together and worked with both of you to help preserve those homes for Burnaby. Now, we had the announcement in July, but it took months, probably even more than a year, to really get to that point. Thom, can you tell us a little bit about what led? What happened there? How did those members get involved with each other and with you to help preserve their homes that they were in danger of losing?
Well, you're right. And it was that danger that really catalyzed the response of the members. We spend so much time talking about new builds and new supply of housing. And sometimes we forget to note that it's just as important to preserve and protect the housing that we already have. And the 2 co-ops in Burnaby, like many other co-ops in the province, were on land, but not land leased from a crown corporation or a municipality or another level of government. They were on land leased from a pension fund. And of course, when leases are up, the pension fund has an obligation to its pensioners to maximize the value of that asset and to either renew the lease for a higher payment or sell the property. And in this case, that's what was happening. The property was put on the market for sale. And there were a number of potential buyers whose business model would have put the security of tenure of the members and their affordability at risk. And the members understood that. They also understood that they had federated for a reason. They were members of CHFBC. One of the promises that we make to our members is that when they need us, we'll have their backs. So we stepped in through the connections we have with various levels of government and through the capacity we have on our team at the Community Land Trust, and put together a deal to buy the properties and protect and preserve the security of tenure and affordability for those members forever. And that's really why we exist, is to unite, protect, and serve and represent our members. And in this case, that's what happened.
So in this case, we have 425 households that now can rest easy knowing that their housing is preserved. And so, Tiffany, how is that different? I mean, right now, we're going to have the CLT owning the land rather than a pension fund or another organization. What difference does that mean in terms of housing stability?
I think the important thing is that the housing is secure, and we're aligned with the best interest of the preservation of the co-ops and working with those boards and those members. So I think there's a calming sense of, and we've met with actually the membership of both the housing co-ops. And, I think there's that sense that they do feel secure. There's still changes that are going to come, but the change is done in an alignment and a partnership with two organizations that are there to preserve not just the housing co-op, but the affordability for those that most need it as well, and work with them. And so that they're truly at the table with us and we are one community and not just kind of partners acting on each other's behalf, which is what can happen when you're dealing with more of an outside organization as the landowner. The CLT is here as a landowner and working with those housing co-ops in the best interest of their members. And, like as Thom said, we're here, to work with and serve them in some respect, but also still managing those relationships with those that have put trust into the Community Land Trust. And that is our partnership with the City of Burnaby and other levels of government as well. So it's kind of, we've got a dual function. It's not just, with the co-op, but also with our partners as well.
Yeah, you hear a lot of talk these days about the financialization of housing. And so often in those conversations, it seems like such an abstract concept. And this is where it becomes real because, if the business model of a landowner is to generate a return to shareholders from selling the asset to realize a gain or, crystallize the equity that's appreciated on the property, the result for people who need long-term, safe, secure, affordable housing is pretty predictable. So the Community Land Trust exists as kind of an antidote to the financialization of housing. It exists to preserve housing for people's homes, not for a return on investment. And that's the big difference for me.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that, Thom. And we do know that the financialization of housing is something that people are very concerned about. Now, part of what happened there, these are large, older concrete towers. Evidently, they'll need repair, but they're fairly dense already. I do want to explore a couple of other projects because, of course, there's co-ops right across British Columbia, and part of the trend that we're seeing is densification as we welcome more people to British Columbia. And I did want to talk a little bit about Hoy Creek, because here's a project where, once again, longstanding, well-established co-op, and you're exploring a different approach there to be able to not only preserve housing, but actually create more housing for co-op members. Thom, can you talk a little bit about what's happening at Hoy Creek?
Well, Hoy Creek is one of the developments we're proudest of. It's a co-op that really took the brunt of the leaky co-op or leaky condo phenomenon back in the early part of the 2000s. It was catastrophically leaky almost from day one. It had many more homes than you see on the site now. Some of them were demolished because they were simply unfit to live in. So that left 97 townhomes on a very large site that could accommodate many more. But they fell into not only physical disrepair, but financial distress as well. So we did work with our partners at Vancity to structure a financing deal that really took CMHC out of the picture and put the Community Land Trust in place as the owner of the property. And from there, the potential just became limitless, really. There's many, many more homes that can go on that site. It'll be a phased development in 3 phases. The first phase is almost complete and ready for people to move into. And we're very excited to see what the future of that community might look like.
So, Tiffany, how is this going to work with Hoy Creek? There's this change here, and the CLT is now involved. What does that mean when you take a look, when you are considering what you can do with the site and what types of housing you might be able to build?
Yeah, I think the priority obviously was the first phase, which was the replacement of the existing housing co-op buildings, I should say, not the co-op replacement. So there's 132 homes that are getting built right now in the middle of the site. And as Thom said, it is going to be complete this spring, well, in 2023. And then we're going to be working on, and we're into the city approval process right now for the phase 2, to add, upwards of another 150 homes, cooperative homes on the site. And phase 3 will add additional cooperative homes as well. One of the interesting things, though, that I see, especially when you're redeveloping with an existing community, is that, you're dealing with people that these are their homes. And they're going through a lot of change right now as they're looking towards their new building, and also increasing their membership, from 97 members in their co-op and going up to 132. And who are these new people that are going to be joining their community? A community that's pretty, has been with each other, been through a lot with one another, and gone through a lot of change, all the way from the receivership, going through a redevelopment process, and then a new building and welcoming new members. And this is where, I'm quite proud of the Community Land Trust and the support that our team and the staff gives to that co-op, coming in to work through those challenges with them. Like, how do you want to move? Do we need to hire movers? What are, setting the new housing charges that meet the government funding program it's being funded under the Community Housing Fund. So there's a lot of things that, people are going through a redevelopment, and it's not just about the bricks and mortar. It's about realizing that we're dealing with people and people's homes. And, I couldn't be more proud of the team here and that support that they're giving that board and those members to get them excited and get them prepared and to de-stress that whole process for them. And then work with them as well of what's going to happen in the phase 2 and phase 3. As well. So, they're going to be neighbors to these new housing developments as well, but also living in construction, just as they've been living for the past 2 years. So there's support and communication and everything that goes back with regards to that, to basically inform people so that they're not surprised when things start to happen, and that they feel included not just in their own community, but the broader community as the rest of the property gets developed out.
Yeah, that's the real story, isn't it? I mean, it's so easy to get caught up in unit counts. We're developing this many units or dollar counts, but it's really the satisfaction comes from creating or protecting people's homes and giving them a chance to create their own communities. And that's really the work we're involved in. And it's such an exciting time to be part of the co-op housing movement, because 10, 15 years ago, we didn't have the tools to step in and play this kind of role. I mean, co-ops have always been one-off housing providers. It's a very disaggregated real estate asset base. So there never was the capacity to leverage what we have to create more and to protect more of what we have. And that's the element that the Community Land Trust introduces into the equation, and means we can be a more responsible partner and a more active and a more ambitious player in the housing market to pursue that goal of safe, secure, affordable housing, so that everyone can have a home in a co-op to call their own.
Yeah. I think you've touched on so much here, and the importance of recognizing community and the people who are living in these buildings. I'd love to get your thoughts on how do you think it's different for a co-op and for the Community Land Trust to be engaging with residents who are going through this process to build a new building? And do you think that there's differences as well in terms of the community around the co-op and the types of questions that you might be getting, or the way that you work with community? Is that different for you for co-ops, perhaps, than it might be for other developers?
I don't know. It's kind of interesting from my perspective, and what I've seen from communication just outside of, like, say, the co-op itself, is that there actually hasn't been a lot of communication with us, except for people might show up at an open house through the municipal process, and there's an over sense of excitement of what we're doing, because we either, we're rehabilitating, either renovating, existing housing co-ops, or redeveloping, like at Hoy Creek, so people see that there is new housing and revival of these sites that have gone into disrepair, and most of them are from that leaky condo kind of marketplace a few decades ago. And so there's a lot of interest, and there's also a lot of interest in what Thom had mentioned earlier when talking about the best kept secret, because a lot of people go, well, what's a housing co-op? And when we start to explain what it is, and especially the existing co-op that's there, people are amazed that this type of housing exists, because it's not widely known out there in the general public. And some of those conversations are some of the most fun ones that I get to have with people, is to explain the housing and the opportunities that might be available to others that might be looking for housing, and make those introductions to those co-ops if they're interested in seeking membership in a home. And then we've had a great experience, like at the press release for the Burnaby co-ops back in July. It was after the event and standing outside as people were leaving, and having a couple of community members come up to us that are neighbors that lived in the towers, and said what a great thing it was that we were able to do. Because, they had heard that the buildings were up for sale, and knew that housing needed to be protected. And when they came up and asked what the event was, and we were able to tell them, they were all very happy, that we were able to kind of put that deal together. So I've only had positive experiences, and chances for education to spread, what are housing co-ops all about.
I was never able to successfully explain to my parents what I do for a living, because the notion of a housing co-op is so unique in our housing market. But the more success we have, the more profile we achieve. I think the word is getting out, and stories like yours, Sara, about the experience you had living in a co-op really help. And we meet co-op members throughout the civil servants and the elected officials that we deal with. A day doesn't go by when someone won't say to me, "Oh, I grew up in a housing co-op," or "I lived in a co-op." It's just, the stories are countless, and it's really gratifying, as is the support we're getting from every level of government, through municipalities, through the province, through BC Housing, and up to the federal government. It's really gratifying to know that we have partnerships we can rely on, and that will help us all pursue the missions that we think are so important.
We talk a lot in housing about community opposition to housing projects, and I think it's really wonderful that you're sharing the positive receptions that you're having in communities, because it's true. There are many communities and members of communities that welcome housing, and we should be really paying attention to that as well, because it ultimately, it's by working together, we can help deliver more housing and build more thriving communities, right?
Yeah, it makes sense that happens, because housing co-ops are organized around a set of international principles, right? One of which is concern for community. So it's very common for members of housing co-ops to be concerned not just with their own backyard, but they get involved in the larger community surrounding the co-op. They volunteer, they vote, they get engaged. So that brings them into touch with their neighbors in ways that perhaps you don't see in other forms of tenure. And that builds a positive perception of co-op housing that shows up when proposals come before councils and end up being the topic of conversation at a public hearing. You hear that positive expression of support that may not be there for other forms of tenure. They should be there for other forms of tenure, but we're lucky, I guess, that the members we serve are also the best ambassadors for the work we do every day.
That's so true. I do want to just take a moment to talk about a couple of other projects. And now we, of course, at Tiffany, we've got the Sunshine Co-op in Surrey, Bakerview in Abbotsford. Can you tell us just a little bit about, how many of these projects are underway that the CLT is involved with, in addition to Hoy Creek and the Carston and Maybury co-ops here in Burnaby?
Yeah, we've got, like I said, there's Sunshine that's going to be starting construction soon. And that's really kind of a unique situation where, they are on leased land, city leased land with the city of Surrey. But instead of just kind of ending that lease with the co-op and losing those homes, the city, stepped in and found a new site to relocate them with, and wanted to partner with the Community Land Trust to be, their partner in the deal, and trusting that we had the best interest of Sunshine Housing Co-op. And they actually worked with us to find a site that wasn't miles or kilometers away from the existing site. It's literally less than a kilometer, and we'll be taking that co-op from 39 homes to 69 homes, so almost double, which will be exciting. And very similar to Hoy, we'll be going through that change process with them, and we'll be there supporting the board and their members all the way throughout, the construction build, which will probably be about 2 years. We're looking at completion in the fall of 2025. And we've got, we talk about the preservation, in Burnaby. One of the first ones that we were able to actually preserve was 94 homes out in Abbotsford with Bakerview Housing Co-op. And that was a renewal project that we worked in partnership with Vancity to look at the purchase out of the existing mortgage with CMHC, and then investing about $5.5 million into that housing co-op. And we often say that we took something that might have been the worst looking buildings in the neighborhood to actually the best looking buildings in the neighborhood. And we're quite kind of proud of that partnership, because that really kind of sparked kind of a different type of approach with preserve and renewal, rather than just what we talk about, which is the new housing co-ops as well. But we do have new ones that are coming on board soon. North Arm Housing Co-op in Vancouver. And we're also under construction with some large projects in partnership with the City of Vancouver as well, for probably, I think, we've got about another 300 co-op homes coming to the City of Vancouver.
I think that so many of these projects are really exciting. Now, I do want to squeeze in one last question. And Thom, you mentioned that so much has changed for co-ops in the last 10 to 15 years. If you look ahead 10 to 15 years, what do you think that the future holds for cooperative housing here in British Columbia?
I think the future is very bright for co-ops. As a model, it's receiving more positive attention than I recall it getting in the past. But the big change is that we now have the capacity as a co-op housing sector to deliver on the promise of co-ops, and to actually create new co-op homes, protect the co-op homes that are in the market now, and build a sector that can provide a housing alternative, in that mid-range between owning and renting, that so many people desperately need. And I think governments are realizing that the co-op housing sector can be a real partner in delivering on those mutual housing goals. So I see nothing but positives for co-op housing in the next 5, 10, 15, 20, and 50 years.
And what about you, Tiffany? If you look 15 years out, what do you see for the CLT?
Yeah, and I think we kind of come back to that community aspect of housing co-ops, and you look at the changing geographic nature of the housing sector, just as we look to densify in cities, and we're building these buildings for people to move into, and we're not thinking about layering in that community aspect. So we've got lots of families that are living in very dense and urban areas, and sure, there's outdoor parks to go to and other city services, but what's happening in those buildings, in that sense of community? And I just see, even from my own education and learning experience, that's really where housing co-ops fit in, especially in those urban environments. They bring back that sense of neighborhood into a building, rather than like a footprint of a neighborhood of the old-fashioned single-family home neighborhoods, right? So it's amazing to kind of see especially when we have brand new co-ops that come on board, you might have 150 to 200 new people that have moved into that housing co-op, and see how they work together and where they were when they were first admitted as members to where they are a year later. And it's just amazing to kind of see the things that they're able to achieve and work to build that community and support each other, whether it be, Facebook sharing sites, for kids clothing, or like dog sitting, kid sitting, all sorts of different things. And that, I think that is something that is missing when we look at, families moving into more urban areas, and co-ops fill that gap.
I'd like to, think about what did the pandemic teach us? Not that it's over yet, but people feel like they're emerging from those lockdown days, and the pandemic taught us that we need each other, because where people suffered, where they struggled, was because they became disconnected from each other, and the the typical support systems that they had come to rely on. So if the lesson is that we need each other, what better form of housing to respond to that need than a co-op, where the focus isn't just on bricks and mortar, but on the community that emerges from people working together toward a common goal, having input and control over their housing conditions, and being part of a movement that emphasizes equity and inclusion and community above all else. So that's, I think, as a pandemic response, I think of co-ops as the perfect solution for the challenges that we're facing.
Oh, thank you both so much. And that's a really great place to leave the conversation today. This has been a really, really uplifting conversation. I really appreciate learning more about the future, history and the future of co-ops in the CLT here for British Columbia. Thom, Tiffany, thank you so much for joining us. Let's talk again soon. To learn more about housing cooperatives in British Columbia and how to apply to become a member, visit chf.bc.ca.
To learn more about BC Housing or to apply for subsidized housing in British Columbia, visit our website at bchousing.org.